Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. This is, I suppose, in many ways a continuation of a series that we've been doing in conjunction with Pride Living, where we look at various things that are impacting aged care providers. And today's session is looking at the task force recommendations, and in particular, additional services, recommendation 11. And to discuss that and to discuss a broader, I suppose, a discussion to do with developing a white paper and also having people's views, which we'll be asking for through a poll that we'll launch in the context of this webinar. We're joined by Bruce Bailey, who you can see on the screen there. Bruce is the Managing Director of Pride Living. Welcome, Bruce.
Thanks, Sean. And thank you everyone for making the time available to come along to what we think is a pretty important issue for the industry to be involved in. As you know, recommendation 11 came out with the task force. The language is a bit ambiguous, and so there's some degree of uncertainty around what is actually meant for the future of additional services. So we thought, given our position in the additional services market, that we would host this webinar and another one next week. Just because it was short notice, we thought we'd do two different sessions to maximise people's opportunity to attend. The issues as we see it are that the additional services models that are proposed in recommendation 11 represent a significant change, and with that provide some challenges. When I read the recommendations, it caused me to engage with people who are involved in the task force to see what I could find out in terms of background. A couple of things came out that were very important, I thought. Firstly, that the task force recognised the ongoing and important function of additional services within the funding mix and the care models or service models for aged care. So they're committed to it. The task force, and I think I heard Tom Simonson say this, and also Grant Corduroy, that it was a group of people and they needed to come to a consensus position, and there were certain voices from the consumer advocacy area, and they were fairly strident that we had to have consumer choice and an ability to opt out, and they were particularly concerned about an admissions criteria where consumers accepted additional services or had to accept additional services to enter a particular facility. So with that, the task force came out with its recommendations, and James will talk particularly to what he sees in those recommendations shortly, and James leads our additional services practice consulting. We've also got Victor Harcourt with us today, which is great. Victor's well known in the sector, has had significant involvement in aged care, in additional services and other areas of aged care. We've worked with Victor on a number of things, value his opinion and his firm's opinion, and so we thought we'd do this together and we'd get a technical update from the overall structure of control of additional services under the Aged Care Act. Also some experiences that Victor can share with us in terms of actions that have been happening from the Commission and with issues that he sees of concern going forward. So it's a fairly comprehensive coverage of what's happened. And I'd like to, at this stage, Sean mentioned we'd do some polls. I just want to get a sense of the audience as to who is currently operating an additional services package and who is not. Now, Sean tells me that he will put a poll up and this will happen and we'll see it on screen. So there you are. The first question, do you have an additional services program? If we could give people a chance to answer that question. I take it it'll come up somewhere in the background for me. And the second question there will get you also to answer. We just wanted to get a gauge of your level of concern about recommendation 11, where one is you're not particularly concerned and 4 is that you're very concerned about it. And I sense that this second question will be more relevant to those who are running additional services programs. So we can get changed. So I guess they will stay up for a little while, those polls, and you can keep or filling your answers as you go. So after I said I went and had some conversations, and I guess the essence of what's come back in those conversations to me, and this was confirmed at the Leaders Summit when we had Christopher Pyne talking about how to lobby government, which was very good because it was before I was talking to the department. And I think it's important to understand this task force came out with a series of recommendations, including 11, and it has ministerial support. It's come out of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and it is effectively the direction that's going. And picking up on what Christopher Pyne said, it would be silly for anyone to go in and say, well, they've got it wrong and we need to change it. That's not going to happen. We, as participants in the sector, need to engage with what the direction of it is. And from the feedback I had from the department, that they said there are issues around implementation. They understand some of the complexities around having opt-in after entry and opt-out provisions. And so we thought that we'd try and put together a bit of a white paper, get some feedback from a survey that we'll do after this session of providers, so we can make sure that the concerns of providers are taken into account in the implementation of the recommendation 11. Just allied to that, in my discussions, it came out, I think a fair representation is that the task force members were not as well versed in the issues and intricacies of additional services. They just see it as a charge to consumers for services. They don't understand the practicalities of it. And so it's possible that without a good representation from the sector, that you might be saddled with operational provisions that are difficult to meet. So again, we want to try and put those together. So we'll see what happens. So there we are. We've just got some poll results up. We've got 82% of people currently providing additional services, and in the concern level, it seems to be most people are extremely concerned or very concerned, choosing sort of 3 and 4. I think James has said to me he's feeling more comfortable with the direction as he gets into it more, but again, we don't know until we see what's happening. Just in terms of change, I understand that there are a number of new policy proposals that have been put forward by the department emerging out of the recommendations. The normal pathway for those is that they go to the 3 central agencies, that's PM&C, Cabinet and Treasury and Finance, and then those position papers from those departments are considered by Cabinet before the policies are signed off on. That, to me, suggests that some of the changes won't come in the budget. My sense is probably the changes that don't affect government and funding are more likely to come in because they're not so difficult. So we've got a staggered timing. I was told that there was likely to be an engagement period with the sector over additional services implementation, and that would probably allow for 6 weeks was the number that was suggested to me. So I think all the signs are good that we can have influence in what happens, but we do need to be organised and engage as providers. So with that introduction, I'll hand over to James now, who will take us through the current consumer protections. He's also going to talk initially about accommodation payments, because we want to see how the system works in relation to other consumer payments and the propositions that are being put forward in relation to the additional services. Now, we're going to do a quick shift of chairs here, and I'll hand over to James.
Thanks for that, Bruce. So, as I said, we'll go straight. I'll just share my screen. there eventually. Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, it's important in any additional service program that we've helped providers with. We've been very mindful of government policy, and we've shared this with government. We've got to remember that the Australian aged care policy is grounded in the principle that aged care should be accessible and affordable to all Australians that need it. We've also got the accreditation standards that have at their core this notion of consumer choice and protection. So it's really important that we base any additional service program to align with those objectives. We already have current consumer protections, and we'll talk about how that was a real focus of the task force. We've already got, for entry, we've got a complex AN-ACC assessment process. We've got the resident contributions in the form of the basic daily fee, complex means testing arrangements, approval of RADs up over 550,000, price disclosure on My Aged Care, government subsidies for those with low means, and then the additional service program itself is based on having the capacity to benefit. What we've also got, the government recognises that facilities do vary from facility to facility. And so we do have a market-based approach for accommodation charges. So a RAD, you can pick your figure from 0 up to 550,000. And if you want to go over 550,000, you just need to submit that to IACPA, and you can get approval that way. So we recognise that the government does see that there is a market force there. Residents, so that providers don't skew or exclude people from entry, that the resident doesn't need to decide which way they're going to pay until after 6 months after entry. IACPA have to provide those approval for that cap. Now, that is interesting, that approach, because if you've got a higher RAD, that may exclude some residents. So that, you know, if you have a RAD of 750,000, just because IACPA have said that the service from the facility represents that reasonable value, we may have people that can't afford it. So we already have a system which may exclude some people. And there's no capacity to benefit requirement in the accommodation cost. So if I've got a large room and it's got a balcony and it's got some other features, it's got a gymnasium, and I'm palliative care and I can't use it, I don't get a discount on the RAD. So we already have a precedent there. So, okay. I won't go with that one. So we have, I've already talked about that. Okay. I think all these are weren't these Victor's slides? Yeah. So Victor, I'll leave you to talk to these slides.
Great. Thanks, James. Thanks, Bruce and Sean as well for the opportunity to come along and contribute today to the discussion. I think it's a really important discussion as well. And so the purpose of my a couple of moments here is to provide a little bit of an explanation of the current regulatory framework. Some of this will be well known to you. Some of it I hope will be useful and maybe even new. So with that, all I'm going to do is sort of talk about the fact that the additional services as we see today, the current regulatory framework, flows out of a section that's been in the Aged Care Act since 1997 and has been the same, except for a change in subsections, has been the same for the whole of that time. You've heard me say this before. It's a very simple provision that simply says that it's a responsibility of approved provider to charge no more for any other care or services than an amount agreed beforehand with the care recipient, and to give the care recipient an itemised account of the other care or services. It's probably one of the simplest and least regulated simplest and least significant of the clauses in the Aged Care Act. There's nothing else that regulates additional services, and yet it's generated quite a big amount of controversy, 12 pages of a regulatory bulletin. And indeed, many of you will be familiar that with the fact that up until 2014, there was very little that was done by way of additional services. Primarily, we had a bit of a pick and mix option. You know, you could choose to have a better type of soap and, you know, not much more really. And that was primarily as a result of a policy setting by the department to discourage the use of additional services in addition to the specified care and services and extra services that were provided. The change that came about was a shift in policy by the government that wanted to encourage freedom of choice for all residents about having services over and above that which was the minimum, the specified care and services, and for it not to be restricted to extra services, those who could afford to pay more. Ironically, of course, that was at a time when the current health minister was then the aged care minister, and the policy setting was very much changed and encouraged the use of additional services to promote better and additional choice for residents. And of course, what that did was for aged care providers was really open up the field in terms of the delivery of those services. And what quickly became apparent, and this is where I'm going beyond being a lawyer, but certainly what we saw was that the increased choice and freedom for residents really came about through not just the offering of one or two additional services. It was really from the ability to be able to provide, from an economic point of view, a bundle of services that, when offered and paid for as a bundle, allowed consumers to receive the benefit of those services for a cheaper price than if they paid for them individually. Now, what that then led to was initially an embracing of that, an encouragement by the Department of then Social Services, which had control of this, and it very much encouraged the additional services program as a replacement for extra services. Now, that was the policy setting for a short period of time, and then we started to get a bit of a rollback from primarily the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner at the time, and then variously that's been continued through until we see finally the regulatory bulletin, the 12-page regulatory bulletin, which was issued last year, which provided a more comprehensive overview of what the Commission would accept as being an appropriate additional services program. And there are some elements in that which I will come back to in discussing the current framework, as well as some of the current risks that are in play at the moment. Now, when we identify the relevant areas, I've put up on there a little table that identifies that when we're talking about other care or services, no, go back please. When we talk about other care or services, what we're talking about is care or services which are not in the specified care and services. That's what is meant by the term other. That's what the court has said a few years ago was meant by the term other. Nothing more, nothing less. So what we need to do is to distinguish when we're identifying what is an additional service, that it's either not a specified care or service, either wholly or because it is something in addition to. And that's where we then spring to the additional as opposed to extra. In terms of the current regulatory framework, it's important to note that it's not just the Aged Care Act and the user rights principles that apply here. And I'll mention briefly the user rights principles because, of course, at the heart of the additional services program, as with any relationship with a resident, is the contract. So again, as was explained by the Federal Court, the relationship between an approved provider and a resident is primarily contractual in nature. The Aged Care Act and principles might prescribe the majority of the core provisions that must be included in the contract, but it is primarily contractual. And that's very much recognised by the Act itself, and also in the user rights principles, which very much closely regulates what should be in the resident agreement. So whenever we're talking about the regulatory framework that applies, we must not ignore the operation of contract law. And there it's very simple, and this is where 56(1)(e) reflects contract law. If you're delivering additional care or services, then that must be specified in the agreement, and you deliver what is agreed for the price that you have agreed, and you must deliver that in accordance with the standards that are set out. Given that it is a contractual relationship, the other relevant law that applies here is the Australian Consumer Law. No surprise there. The Australian Consumer Law, of course, regulates the relationship between businesses and the consumers. And what we need to be aware of there is that we don't engage in misleading and deceptive or conduct or unconscionable conduct. We must also ensure that the consumer guarantees that are in the Australian Consumer Law are embedded in the agreement, the way we deliver the program, and that we don't include unfair contract terms. And by and large, of course, that is very much dealt with through the resident agreement and complying with the prescriptions in the Aged Care Act and the principles. And one other key element, of course, in relation to that is ensuring that you have a compliance program that makes sure that what you are delivering, what you promise to deliver, and that's part of the Australian Consumer Law, part of your contractual arrangements as well. So very broadly, that is the sort of regulatory framework that we are talking about. But within that are a plethora, he says, plethora of regulatory compliance issues. And that's what I wanted to just briefly touch on before then moving to the substance of this discussion, where I'll hand back over to James. So in terms of some of the key regulatory compliance issues, and we see these identified in the regulatory bulletin about key things that providers must adhere to in the delivery of the program. And of course, as I mentioned, these areas are quite substantial when you consider we're talking about literally 3 lines, 3 and a bit lines in the entirety of the Aged Care Act. A couple of things to be really mindful of, and that we have seen the Commissioner, after a long period of what we consider to be, well, certainly from the perspective of inquiries or concerns being expressed to us by clients, fairly low-key regulatory intervention, we've started to see more and more clients questioned about their additional services programs by the Commissioner. And themes are coming through in terms of the questions that are being asked. And it appears that there is almost like an investigation protocol being developed about how they will interrogate additional service programs, which springs out of the regulatory bulletin. Some of the areas that we're seeing, not exclusively, but certainly that we think is important, is the Commissioner very much focusing upon the resident agreement. What is it that you have in your initial agreement with residents? What are the terms, and are they being reflected in the delivery of the program? And are you specifying, either in the agreement or adjacent to the agreement, the limitations of what you are promising to deliver? And by limitations, what we're talking about there is, if you've promised, for example, that alcohol is a part of the additional services program, then if there's a limit on how much alcohol can be consumed, then that should be specified. So any limits like that should be in there, as well as the terms and conditions around the agreement. Other areas that we're seeing very much a focus on is the Commissioner wanting to know what information are you providing to a resident, a prospective resident, before they sign up to the additional services, and what are you doing to help a resident understand, a prospective resident understand what the additional services are and what the resident agreement is. So what they're wanting to see is more than just the provision of the agreement. So here's the additional services, here's the list, here's the charge, here's the agreement. They want to see more than that. The other area that they're really focusing on is how you justify, and this has been something that's been around for a long time, but it's been very much brought to the fore again, is, and I think this is going to be very relevant for the discussion around recommendation 11 that James will lead. What they want to know is, how do you define what are the specified care and services? So when you're offering additional services that are a better quality, then what is the standard minimum that meets the specified care and services, and how do you demonstrate that what you're providing is better than? And they're really wanting to drill down in relation to that. Two other matters before I hand back to James. So there's fair warning to you, James, in terms of handing it over. We're seeing the Commissioner starting to focus on variations and mutual consent. And this is an area where we have a difference of view with the Commissioner about what it means. As we know, there are variations and can be variations in relation to the delivery of additional services, in particular pricing. And we build into the resident agreement a number of different ways, including additional services, the ability to be able to have a price variation mechanism going forward, and you sign up in relation to that. We're starting to see the Commissioner wanting to bring that variation back and say, it's not good enough to have that as an agreed mechanism at the start of the contractor relationship, and then it just ticks over as of right. We want to see that you have got a variation that is only effected once you've had mutual consent after consultation on each occasion. Now, we don't think that that is an appropriate interpretation, but we're starting to see that as well. Now, the other area, which I will touch on, and I know I've got a few things there, but I think most of you will be familiar with the content of a lot of that. But one of the other areas that we see is very much an issue here is the substantially better test. So it's one thing if you've got an additional service, it's not even in the specified care and services, that's okay, that's an other. But what they've done is imported into the description of other is a threshold test for distinguishing between the specified care and services and the additional services, and that's the substantially better test. And in many ways, what that actually looks like is the significantly higher test that was used to justify extra services. So what we seem to have is a situation where we were encouraged to move away from extra services, broaden choice, to over the journey now, the regulatory bulletin embedding into there essentially a test that says we're bringing it back to extra services just in a slightly different way. But if you're going to provide something that's in the SCAS and you're going to charge for it, then we want to see it being significantly higher than the average or substantially better. Where that might land ultimately, we're not really sure. Do you use the benchmark list? Do you have some other test? Are they going to try and broaden that to really squeeze out additional services? We're not sure. But of course, the big issue here is at the heart of this is the ability to be able to broaden the choice available to general residents. And there's some of the key things that we're starting to see through the current regulatory action. And I'm sure if I've missed anything, Bruce and or James will remind me and we can talk about that. But for the moment, I will hand over to James.
Great. Thanks, Victor. I think it's a really good point you make about the existing structure that we have. And I just want to, again, remind people that currently, which is different to what the task force is proposing, we have even the My Aged Care website supports providers with this declaration to say that you can have a package as a condition of living in the home, or you can offer it on an ad hoc basis, and we're looking at toiletries, those sort of things. So interesting to see that, you know, what we're looking at in the initial part of the recommendation is quite different to what has been working, I think is a fair thing to say, in the industry up till now. Also, to support that, we often talk about, and the Commission has talked about, protection of supported residents. I think it is a really important point. I've just put this slide up just to show whenever people say, well, you know, we've got 40% supported residents, should we waive a fee, etc. Just to show you here, these, you know, as of the 20th of March, the rates have just gone up again, but you can see there what a typical expenditure and income focus looks like for a fully supported resident. And you can see there, once they've paid for their daily basic fees and medications up to the PBS concessional threshold, residents still have a disposable income of around $17 a day. So we'd be hoping if there was any cap put on, there'd be recognition that it doesn't need to be fully waived. And the task force did actually talk about being able to expand a fee to fully supported residents. So let's talk about a recommendation 11. Well, generally what's great is that it supports what a lot of providers have been talking about, the deregulation of the basic daily fee with inclusion of the additional service fee. And it embeds that principle of choice. It does propose greater regulatory protection. And then there's, as we've talked about, preference for post-admission decision was part of the initial recommendation. So I just want to pick up, there's some key phrases, and you'd all recognise this when you've read the recommendations, but just pick up on a few bits there. It's saying that the task force is supporting that providers should be able to provide additional services to provide greater flexibility and value, to negotiate daily basic fees above the minimum so they can access these sort of services, as long as they have a willingness and means to pay. So we go back to those original two protections we talked about on the first slide. So the recommendation in the principal support priority was publishing the price and services, only allowing agreement after the resident has entered care, and a cooling off period to ensure that all residents still want and can use them. The alternative that the Commission has put just below the highlighted preference is to say, without the above recommendations, there need to be a cap on what providers can charge. And the task force believes there needs to be ongoing monitoring with appropriate action to ensure these protections adhered to. In other words, a regulatory framework similar to what we see in the prudential arrangements around RADs. So just a quick summary of what we see in the initial, our thoughts on the initial recommendations. Obviously, publishing additional service prices. This is consistent with what all providers do now with the accommodation charge. So we don't see any real issue with doing that. Allowing for agreement after entry, it could have possible unintended consequences, user rights relating to security of tenure. And this is something that Victor has highlighted with me. We currently have situations in aged care facilities where a resident's agreed to pay a RAD, entered the facility, and they decided not to pay it. And there's been real issues about, can we remove the resident from that room, etc. So if we were going to have a system where it's limited to an additional service program in a particular wing, for example, we would need to see a clearer pathway for managing security of tenure. A lot of additional services are actually linked to a room. Bar fridges, for example, televisions, private telephones, for example, are limited to a room and difficult to remove. And then we've got in-room facilities, which may result in a class of residents. And you've probably all heard me before. The example that's always given to me is we don't want to have a situation in the dining room where we say, Ted, here's your beer. And Barry says, I'd like to have a beer too. Sorry, Barry, your family didn't pay for it. No provider wants that situation, especially when 50% of our residents have got cognitive impairment and won't appreciate the subtleties around making those sort of judgment calls. The cooling off period, obviously we had the same sort of concerns about how do you manage that in a residential aged care facility. A cap on additional service charges, well, we support that. Again, we realise there needs to be protections. There would need to be a rate for fully supported residents and another rate for self-funded retirees. The monitoring of providers, we would support that. It would result, we know that packages like accreditation need to be managed from a compliance point of view. You only need a new chef to come in and suddenly the second meal's removed. And we know in situations of COVID, we had no bus trips. So we do need to have a system. We're hoping that it would be a self-regulatory regime. And we know that changes in residents' acuity, we would need to maintain the current program, which is in the bulletin, that we have a program to monitor capacity to benefit. And again, we would hope that that would remain self-regulated. Finally, how do they enforce this? There would be, suggesting there's no detail of this, but a penalty regime similar to what we see with the pricing of RADs, external complaints process managed through the Commission possibly, and penalties for those that don't comply. So from what you've read in the two recommendations, we've sort of suggested there were two possible models to fit that we could see how these would work. So option A, which was the highlighted section of the recommendation, we could see this operating similar to an extra service wing. This is where you would have each area of the facility would have a different price point. Same as though you would pay, there would be a RAD associated with the room, and there would be an additional service fee associated with the room and the wing in which that resident was housed. If their preference changed, the cooling off period, for example, that resident would need to move from that wing and that room. And as we said, that's obviously got a whole lot of security of tenure issues that we would need to sort. Possibly this could be subject to a sunset provision, so we don't have to keep offering that service. Some of the elements of that, security of tenure that I mentioned, what we would ultimately see is possibly a redesign of aged care facilities with different serving levels, a bit like an aeroplane has first class, business class and economy. We may see that, which does kind of go against the ethic of a lot of aged care providers about equity and service delivery for all residents. Being able to accommodate multiple service wings. Now, for example, would you have an option for someone that needs a memory support unit? Would you be able to transfer them to a different wing? That may not be possible. And then we would need a significant transition period, and we'd hope there'd be grandparenting as well to allow us to redesign our facilities accordingly. And we'd have to look at what the penalties were for those that don't comply with that system. And then we come to option B, regulated pre-entry decision, similar to what many aged care providers are currently doing. So we would see a cap for fully supported residents, and then a cap for self-funded retirees. And then we would liken the structure to what we see with accommodation, is that IHACPA would be responsible for approving additional service fees beyond the initial cap, and we would see indexation for those capped in line with CPI or another index. Providers decide to package on an individual service model, and again, we would publish those inclusions on My Aged Care, and we don't see any issue with that. For affordability, we would like to see that people can pay food from drawing down from the RAD, and a formal self-regulation system, similar to what we have again with RADs. So the considerations of that, well, we already have, as I was saying, the cooking shows. Here are one prepared earlier. We already have seen, we at Pride Living have about 20,000 aged care places operating with our assistance under that model. Consumer and provider feedback tells us it's totally acceptable, and there's been few complaints related to that. It does address the issue about consumer protections, that access to aged care, and may also result in greater clarity of what constitutes an additional service. I know a lot of providers really struggle to say, well, is it an additional service? Is it specified care and services? If IHACPA was given the job of approving additional service fees over the cap, we would then see their rationale for what they include as a service, which we could apply for services even below the cap. So this model does address the principal concerns of Alternative 1 and the task force recommendations. So I'm now going to hand you back to Bruce to talk some questions.
Sliding right across. So thank you, Victor and James. As you can see, at the moment, the regulatory framework is within the Act quite limited. And so it's possible that there will be a significantly beefed up regulatory framework within the Act or principles. And so this is the opportunity to have some input into that, if you like, implementation direction, and that's what we're seeking to do. In terms of that, I'd love if you'd start sending in any questions that you've got. I can see a couple up on the screen and we'll have a look at those in a minute. But please raise any questions. We really do want to engage with the participants on this. And what we're also proposing to do is we want to send out a survey to those who have registered for the event and ask questions around the issues that we've raised or that James has raised in those sort of, if you like, options 1 and 2. Do you support? Are you concerned about those sort of questions? And unfortunately, it's very difficult for us to get good data on the prevalence of additional services across the sector. So we also ask for participants, if you're running additional services, because quite a number of people who have come to the webinar are not clients of ours, which is fine. It's an information session for the sector. But we just want to try and get a broader handle on the percentage of people who are, or percentage of beds that are covered by additional services, so that we can understand the complexity and extent of the issue. So that's that. We've got a couple of other poll questions. Sean, if you could bring that up now, I might get those answers coming through.
Yeah, a few questions here, Bruce, that I might even just read out, because people who've asked questions, there's quite a few here, so I might read them out because people on the call can't see anybody else's questions. So we'll just read them out so everybody sort of gets an answer to the collective questions that have been asked. And the first question, and this is obviously for Victor and Bruce there, how frequently is it recommended to assess the resident's ability to benefit from additional care and services?
James, I'm going to tag team here.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, generally so obviously either pre-entry or at the time of entry. So if you're doing the tour, you can say to people, you'll pay this fee. If you don't have capacity to benefit, then we'll reduce the fee or remove it altogether. And then what we suggest is with every care plan review that you do, including when there's a significant change in the health condition.
Okay, thanks, James.
Sorry,
Another
in relation to that, Sean, it's just to add to that, the regulatory bulletin also identifies the Commissioner's expectation that the review should take place when there's been a functional capacity change of the resident that's known, and that might occur between care plan reviews. And it may be if the resident reasonably requests a review, the Commissioner expects there to be a review of their ability to be able to derive a benefit. And it's not about whether they choose to benefit, but whether they have the capacity to benefit.
Thanks, Victor. Probably another question for you here, Victor. Should the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission have regulations to enforce basic consumer protections and reduce the dependency on the ACCC to make it easier to deal with the one regulator? What are the pros and cons?
I think the really interesting thing about that is that my perspective, I think that certain regulators specialise in certain areas. That's why they have the function of the regulation. It seems to me that the ACCC is best placed to deal with Australian consumer law matters. They deal with Australian consumer law matters across a number of industries across Australia, and they do it very well. I don't see, and so I'm not going to argue the pros and cons, I just can tell you my view. So I don't see that the Commissioner has a mandate to go beyond their role in terms of being the regulator and monitor with respect to matters concerning the aged care legislative scheme. We should leave the experts deal with their particular areas.
Okay, thanks. Another question here. Will the new Act remove extra services entirely and they only have additional services going forward? Maybe James?
Well, obviously there'd have to be grandparenting arrangements for the existing providers as there is now. Whilst there's no new approvals since July 2014, we still have quite a number of extra service approvals and residents with those agreements. So it could be that they would have a grandparenting arrangement to say when those residents are no longer in care, that could be removed. We just have to see, because none of the principles have been released in the draft exposure of the Act.
Okay, thanks, James. Victor, a question specifically for you. Victor, one of your slides referenced cost versus value. Can you please expand on this?
Yeah, the reference there was in relation to I suppose queries that we've had from the Commission from time to time in relation to whether what should be specified as the itemised cost is the actual price paid or the value that we attribute to a particular item less the discount. Underlying that, and that's been resolved on the basis of the fact that it's the price paid which is the most relevant, but underlying that is whether there's going to be, and we're sort of not saying we're seeing early signs of it, but whether we're going to start going back to the Commission, actually wanting to drill down and ask questions about not what the actual agreed price is, but is the value of what is being charged for actually justified by the price. So it's about whether that is going to be an area of concern going forward or not.
If I might just add a bit to that, in one of the conversations I had, it was suggested that the Commission is interested, or sorry, IHACPA is interested in what's the cost of providing these services, and if there is no marginal cost, then are they really additional services? Very difficult to get other than a broad brush approach of what's the cost. And also a lot of people, as James tells me, are already providing significant additional services and not charging for them. So if you looked at the cost of providers, then the costs are already embedded. So it's a very tricky issue to get to, but yeah, so it's difficult.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Another question here. Is the government going to cease ES allocation from 30 June 2024? No info received or confirmation from department.
Well, as I said, there's been no new allocations except for existing providers. So if you already had ESS approval for 20 places and you wrote to them and asked for another 10, they would consider that application, but there's been no new provider applications since July 2014.
Okay. A question here. What are your thoughts on itemised bills where, for example, additional services are offered for streaming TV services, free coffee, etc.? Families are requesting itemised bills for usage off the streaming services, hours per day, that type of thing. How itemised are we looking here?
So the bulletin, the regulatory bulletin that came out in June does clarify this approach. It says if you offer a package approach, then the details, the itemisation of each service and the description and the value, as long as that's included in the residential care agreement, you don't need to provide an itemised account on a monthly basis, for example. So that would only be hairdressing, for example, would be considered monthly or however you do your billing. but the package services, as long as there's an itemisation of the fee structure and the service description, can be in the residential care agreement.
Okay, thanks, James. A couple of people have asked about the first part of the session. Just to answer that, if you missed the first part of this session, we'll be emailing a recording of the whole session that you're welcome to reference. And I think Bruce will be including a questionnaire with that as well for your input. Another question here, how likely is it that all the ability for additional services to be mandatory will be removed? And will it be fully opt-in as an option?
Well, I don't know is the short answer. As I said at the start, the consumer advocacy group has a significant issue with people being excluded from an aged care facility because they can't afford to or don't want to take on the additional services. So that's the view. When I first heard this view expressed, and it was back last year, I came back to James and Megan and asked them to go to all of our clients and get me all the data we could get on complaints from consumers about not getting value or not wanting to be in the system or whatever the complaints were. And we found an incredibly low rate of complaint. And this is what I want to get to the bottom of. There's, at the moment, the task force has heard the perception of disaffection with the current model of additional services. I'd like to have some evidence because I reckon evidence always beats opinion. And that's what I want to do in this survey is I want to get participants to this webinar to tell me realistically what's the level of complaints. Do they see that having people make a decision beforehand causes people not to come into their facility? I think the more that we can demonstrate that it's not a barrier to entry, the more chance that you can have a situation where, and I think this is probably the best outcome we can get, people will come in, you can have a mandatory system for additional services, but you must have an opt-out provision at some point in time, maybe 3, maybe 6 months down the track. That gives the provider the capacity to demonstrate the value, and it gives the resident the capacity to see the value. The big problem is, of course, security of tenure and how you deal with those issues. So I think this is where we've got to be involved in clarifying the practical issues of implementation.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. There's a question here that sort of ties back to that. Some speculation that there have been calls for legislative provisions that funds received for a purpose must be spent on that purpose. Example, care funds only on care. If implemented across the board, what implications would this have for additional services?
I mean, these are just broad sort of policy discussions. I think there's two things that are being added together there and probably not correctly. The government is committed to care money, which they're paying for, and under the task force recommendations, they're going to fully fund care effectively. They want that money to be spent on care. So read into that is providers will not make a profit out of care. They'll recover costs and get a basic positive outcome. The government is not, and I've heard nothing that suggests anywhere that there's a desire to regulate how much can be charged in other areas. They just want to protect consumers against exploitation, and that's the framework we've got now. So I think at the end of the day, the government's prescription on where money is spent will stop at care because that's the money they're spending, and they go back to the past under the previous system where care profitability subsidised accommodation and lifestyle losses, and there's lots of evidence of that in the Stewart Brown data sets.
Okay, thanks. I think that's all the questions. So So thank you to each of you.
Sean, just before that, there's 2 poll questions that we didn't get to ask. Could you just stick those up while you close out, please?
Yeah, it was. I think I put them in the earlier poll. There was. I can reshare the poll.
Oh.
So there was questions. Do you waive or reduce the additional services? Yeah. Sorry. Let me. You may not have seen that. We can probably just touch on that. Can you see that on the screen there now, Bruce?
I can only see the first 2.
Okay. If
Oh,
you
wait,
just scroll down, you'll see. If you scroll down, you'll see them. And in fact, everybody on the call should be able to see the.
okay, so long as they've been answered, that's fine. Thanks.
Yeah. What we'll do with the video recording of today, we'll also share back the poll results. I mean, these are all anonymous, so there's no names against them. But you'll see. I mean, I can read them out just for anybody that might not be able to see the results. Do you have? And this was almost 100% of the people that answered these. So do you have an additional services program? 82% of people said yes, 18% said no. How concerned are you about recommendation 11? A rating of 4 was extremely concerned. A rating of 1 was least concerned. So 4 came in at 25%, 3, 41%, 2, 31%, and 1, least concerned, 3%. Then the third question, do you waive or reduce the additional services fee for fully supported residents? 79% of people said yes, we do. We do waive or reduce that fee. 21% said no. And the final question was, do you have a regular process to determine a resident's capacity to benefit? 75% said yes, 25% said no.
There's a job there for 25% of the last group.
So, as I said, you'll get the recording. I think we can probably put the slides there too. In fact, the slides will be in the video, but you'll get the poll. And there is another session that relates to this topic on the 16th of May, which you'll see promoted on Inside Aging. That I think, James, you're leading that, additional services. But thanks, Victor. Thanks, James. Thanks, Bruce, for today. And thanks for everybody that joined us.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Sean.
Thanks a lot.